of it is, I forget already, authorized the use and misuse of the King James Version. Mark Ward is a great he's a great guy. I love his writing style too. He uses a lot of humor in it, and it's an enjoyable read. And I think, have you read it yet, Patty? I know I gave you a copy of it. I think you'll find it enjoyable, not a hard read. So, all right, let's go to Judges chapter 1. The other thing that we're going to do after next Sunday. Now, next Sunday is All Out Sunday, so we're going to have special emphasis on the teaching and preaching and so forth. And then after that begins some series. And what I want to do after next Sunday is begin that series from the book of Judges. But as I said before, I'm not going to walk through it verse by verse or every chapter. We're going to take some selections from that. I think I've chosen, I can't remember if I settled on 6, 7, or 8 judges to present and see how the Lord is very merciful in that study. And so we'll spend some weeks on that. Here in chapter 1 of Judges, though, today kind of want to do a bit of an introduction in both Sunday school and in the morning service. Not so much introduction like who wrote it or that kind of introduction, but just the background really of why we have the book of Judges, and particularly in this, one of the key issues regarding the conquering of the land. And in Judges chapter 1, it kind of, in this section of the Bible, we're kind of going back and forth in time. And you know how sometimes in television you watch that and maybe the program begins and then they lead you up to this dramatic point, and then there's this special music and a little bit of a fade, and you realize, oh, we just backed up in time. Even sometimes it says on the screen 12 days earlier or 3 hours earlier, and it backs up. And the rest of the program leads you up to that dramatic point again, and you realize why they're at that dramatic place, and then it finishes it for you. Most of those programs would probably be better if they just went ahead and didn't go back and just finish it right there. Be done in about 5 minutes, and you probably got the same program. But with the Bible, it's doing that for us. It leads us up, and you see in verse 1, it says, now after the death of Joshua, I mean, we're at that dramatic point. But what we're going to see is it gives us a few verses, and then it's going to back up and talk about the death of Joshua again. And actually, if you were to back up to the book of Joshua, it ends with the death of Joshua and what immediately follows. So there's really this kind of really repetitive emphasis on this transition from Joshua to Judges. And it's a very important transition, emphasized by the very fact that God keeps saying, here's what happened. Okay, here's what happened. Okay, here's what happened. And it answers for us really the question, why is this happening in the book of Judges? And why is it like it is in Judges? And in fact, when you read Judges, it can be a very depressing book of the Bible. I don't recommend, if you're just feeling low, you're like, oh man, so Judges is probably not the place you want to go to feel better, because what you find is just the believers, the followers of God there, you find that they're just like you. And that's not very encouraging. That's kind of depressing that they too are struggling with sins and the same sins and repetitively, and not just in a day, but over the course of time. And generationally, we see that. And you find that Judges is very much like what's going on, not just in the world around us, but in our own lives. And there is great hope, great encouragement in the book of Judges, but that's not the emphasis of the book of Judges. And so You're going to have to hunt for it and intentionally find hope in Judges, because otherwise it's very intentionally showing us the failure of mankind. And so we've got the death of Joshua and a transition from that theocratic leadership through Moses, then Joshua, to what will become a leadership that is, we were simply referred to at the times of the judges. And it's really kind of an odd time of leadership nationally. There's in our minds quite a lack of organization. There's no means of transition from one leader to the other. It's often not clear when one leader begins being the leader and when he ends. It just kind of fades in and out. And the people of Israel are very much in kind of a limbo, they're just kind of in life, just back and forth, up and down. And that's the feel of the book of Judges. So back here in Judges 1, the children of Israel ask a question about conquering the land. They said, "Who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" And the Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand." And then we begin in chapter 1 this section that talks about the children of Israel and their attempt, their order to conquer the land of Israel. And again, this takes into mind the entire book of Joshua, because you remember that Joshua begins with their entrance into the land. And during his lifetime, and those that immediately follow him, that's what they're doing. But Judges picks it up after that. So there's a lot of time in the book of Joshua and Judges. And here is this question, and then the difficulty that they had in doing what God asked them to do in conquering the land. Now, before we look at that, we're going to do one of those big picture, think about the history and the whole story of the Bible. So when we think of it this way, and we're asking the questions related to God commanding them to conquer this land, take this land, which includes killing people. And in fact, it's going to include one of the things that's been really difficult for a lot of Christians to grapple with, and unbelievers attack you with this, and that is God commands them to kill everybody. Men, women, and children. And that's a hard thing for us to grapple with. Well, why does God ask us to do this? I mean, nobody does this today, and that would be just wicked in our context today to say, let's just kill everybody in any kind of warfare. And yet God commands the children of Israel to do that. And so we have to ask and answer questions related to it for you to be able to, with confidence, say, I not only believe the Bible to be true, I believe the God who wrote the Bible and is the main character in the Bible, that he is the one true God that I and you should worship. Otherwise, we're left with a vagueness where we just kind of put that out of our minds, where we want to just kind of ignore that and pretend like it didn't happen. But unbelievers, they're not going to do that. And whether they're vocal or not, there are a lot of people who just simply in their minds reject God because they see God as an unjust, wicked bully who commands people to do things that shouldn't be done. Or simply say, an alternative that is, I just don't believe in the reality of God. I just don't believe it exists. So how do we respond to that? And that's why I want us to have this big picture then. And think with me. We don't have to turn to all of these because I think these is big enough concepts that we all are familiar with them and here probably. First of all, is the first 3 chapters of Genesis. You got creation, and you got ultimately the end of creation after 7 days. 6 days is creation of man and everything that's created, and God declares it very good. And it's very clear from that it's not problematic in any way. I mean, it's perfect. And then in chapter 3, the perfect couple, the 2 perfect people, are tempted, and Eve through deception disobeys God, and Adam through a choice of his will disobeys God and brings sin into the world. And as the representative for all mankind, he starts mankind in a path of sin. And immediately God has to make a judgment. He has to deal with the sin that's there. But instead of destroying Adam and Eve and judging them for their sin, God shows great mercy. He puts them out of his presence and gives us the first promise of being redeemed from the penalty of our sin. And he promises there will be one who will come who will destroy Satan and will bring redemption for you. And they rejoice in that. They're glad to hear that because they're miserable having broken the fellowship that they enjoyed with God. And so at the end of chapter 3, we have this curse now on the earth. We have these briars and weeds and thorns, and we now are cursed to work and make our way by the sweat of our brow. And we're cursed with pain and childbearing. And we have the presence of sin in this world that goes from one generation to the next, to every generation. And so that we're now left in a world, yet God's mercy is not only promised, but it's evident in their lives. So at the end of this first section, we find not only an abundance of God's mercy, but we find also the difficulty that brought. So they go from perfection to expulsion. They're out of the presence of God. In chapter 4, we want to, if we didn't know the Bible already, we'd want to hope that they learned their lesson. And now people turn to God and they obey him. But you already know that's not at all what happens. We have the first murder in the very next chapter. And then in chapter 5, we have the description of the wickedness of mankind. In chapter 6, God begins to talk with the one righteous guy who's left in this world and his small family. And up through chapter 9, we have that story of the flood of the entire world. And only 8 people out of the entire population of this world are left in existence. And God says, prior to that every imagination of man was only evil continually. So we'd hoped that you'd learn your lesson. But in fact, given enough time, man multiplied, but multiplied not in worship of God, multiplied in the depth of their wickedness, to the extent that God said, that's it, enough. All deserve to be judged. And the only thing that was righteous that God could do was destroy them and begin again with Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. He begins again. And what does he do with that? He gives promise. I mean, that's the ending of that portion of this story is that God promises Noah, never again will I destroy the world in this way. So we don't have to live wondering, what if God just decides to destroy everyone and everything again? He's already told us he's not going to do that. So he promises that he will let mankind live, but at the end of that, we went from that hope that, well, Eve even expresses that hope. I've had a child. A man has been born to me. We think she possibly even thought that was the Redeemer. this hope that we would have for mankind, ends in near extinction. We're left with just 8 people to begin again. Well, how would that turn out then once you start over with 8 people? You already know. No better. No better at all. And in fact, chapter 10 and 11 tell us about mankind beginning to multiply again, and immediately the failure of Noah and his one of his sons. And we end up with the Tower of Babel. And what is going on with the Tower of Babel? The new population now is saying, I want another way. I want another way to get to God. God's plan is not for me. And it really is echoed today over and over and over and over again. Truth is what you make it to be. All roads lead to the same place. All that is the same thing that they were saying in Genesis 10 and 11. We want something besides what God says. And that renewal that we had through Noah, and that beginning again, and the fresh ground and fresh animal kingdom, a renewed world, ends in what? Dispersion and isolation. But in that, what we're seeing once again is God's wonderful grace. Rather than destroy all the inhabitants of Babel, I couldn't remember where they were, all the inhabitants who are worshiping in a false way, instead of bringing down fire from heaven or a plague or opening up the ground to swallow them or just taking their life away from them, God says what? Everybody go to your rooms. You go there, you go there, you go there, you go there. If I don't do that, God says, nothing will stop you from coming up with a way to defy God. And maybe you sometimes have been frustrated by the difficulty of communication and languages, and yet you have to recognize what a great thing it is that God has divided the world. Maybe you say, well, why do we have our borders? Let's just open, this is not a political statement necessarily, but why don't we just open our borders up and we'll all just be one big happy world family? No, by God's grace, there's divisions, there's groups of people. Because what would happen if everybody was all one big family and getting along? We would organize ourselves to defy God. I'm not justifying the wars that we have, but one thing it does is it drives people to look to God, ask, if nothing else in the foxhole, those who are fighting the war are saying, oh God, help me. Otherwise, in only peace, man turns away from God. And so God disperses them, puts them in some sense of isolation, and people groups begin then. And then that brings us in Genesis, we're up to chapter 12, but we're going to take the rest of Genesis in one big chunk. Genesis 12 through 50. It really is one subject matter, and the matter there is the people of Israel. At the end of chapter 11, we're introduced to a guy. In chapter 12, we get a little more detail about him, and you know him as Abraham. So we're introduced to him, and from some far out of the way place, God says, I'm going to take you, and I'm going to bring you over here. I'm going to give you a land, and I'm going to multiply you into a lot of people, and I'm going to bless you with the things of this lifetime and of spiritual blessings. And if you would let me be your God, I'll pour these things out on you and you'll enjoy it. And I'll make you a great people. And Abraham says, yes, I'll go. And he leaves his land and he goes to a land that God has promised him. And you see where we're going with this then, that we're gonna drive right into the land and ask, why in Judges are we still fighting over the land, and why are we killing people for this land? And it all goes back to this pattern that we're seeing, that God just simply promises to give this land to Abraham. But it's more than a land. It's more than just the boundaries of that. And it's more than a nation of people that can govern themselves or be governed by God. It's something else, isn't it? And in fact, in that blessing that he gives, that promise of a land and a large group of people and blessing in a material sense and spiritual sense, God also says, through you, all people will be blessed. What? How's that going to be? I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that you picked one guy and you gave them a land and you made them your people. How is that good for everybody? And you know the answer already. Because through that people, God is going to provide that guy in Genesis that was promised, and that God illustrated and promised again through at the time of Noah. And then even in dividing the people through the world, the promise is still there. And now God is saying, I'm gonna do this. Do you see how God, takes these broad paths? I know this is numerically, it doesn't make sense, but in Genesis chapter 3, all the people of the world, I know there's only two, but all the people of the world, God says, here's the promise for you. And then he just kind of brings it in. Noah and his 8, and, dispersing to isolation. And now he says, just to Abraham, I'm going to do this for you. But what I'm going to do for you has benefit to the entire world. Not just those that are alive in a moment, but all people in all time can have benefit from what I'm going to do here. And so God makes this promise to them, to us, through Abraham, and specifically for the people of Israel. So the people of Israel become very important then, because it's through them that all the people of the world are going to have blessing. Then if you walk through this path with Israel, in Genesis 12, again, we're not going to go verse by verse, but the first 3 verses, the Lord gives that promise to Abraham. Verse 5 through 8, he promises them to have a presence in the land. But he says there is going to be a time of difficulty. And in fact, Abraham will leave the land. He'll get there and then he'll leave. He'll go down to Egypt because of famine. There'll be his nephew, Lot, begins to cause difficulty and conflict, and they divide, go their separate ways. And in the midst of that, something interesting is said. In fact, go to Genesis 13, verse 14 through 17. This is a pretty important passage as we look at this big picture pattern that God gives us. Genesis 13, verse 14. This is very contemporary in what's going on in Israel today with the battles and the fights. In Genesis 13, 14, the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, and so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. And then Abraham does. Now, here we don't have the specific boundaries, and in fact, the boundaries are debated then and now. The broadest boundaries, basically the Euphrates River, all the way down to the Nile, essentially, into Egypt. And as far as the west would be the Mediterranean Sea, and far to the east into modern-day Syria and Jordan, well into that. Those are the broadest boundaries, and then others would, at times we see descriptions of boundaries that are different. So our point today is not to argue over the specifics of the boundaries, but the clarity that God did promise a land to the nation of Israel. It's for you. And so God, here we are in chapter 13, a lot has happened since God brought Abram out, and now he's giving him the promise again. After that, you remember some of the well-known things. Abraham has a immoral relationship with his servant, bears a child with her, realizes that is not what God had in mind. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, reminding us of the complete depravity of mankind. And you ever wonder why did Abraham barter with God about them? To remind us of that point. Abraham, he makes an assumption that you and I would make if we said we're going to destroy all the people in a village, a city, a country, a nation. What if God said we're going to destroy everybody except Noah? We would make an assumption. Surely there's some righteous ones in there that are getting caught up in that, aren't there? And Abraham says, God, you're going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? You destroy righteous people with them? And God implies, and the conversation is a recorded board, where God says, no. So if there were at least 50, you wouldn't destroy it. I wouldn't destroy it for 50. Yeah, that's what I thought. Hey, what if there were only 40? Well, I wouldn't destroy it for 40. 30, 20, gets down to 10. What if it's just 10? I wouldn't destroy it for 10. Surely Abraham's thinking, there's 10 righteous in those cities. And so therefore, God's not going to wipe them off the face of the earth. But he does, because there are not 10 righteous people in there. And in fact, we're left, if it wasn't for the New Testament, we would say, I don't think there's any righteous people in there. But the New Testament just squeaks it out for us and says, believe it or not, Lot was a righteous guy. Sure doesn't look like it, but he was. But what is that? Why is that there? To remind us, mankind always pursues the depth of depravity given enough time, given the opportunity. And then Abraham spends time out of the land, or the edge of the land, and you remember his difficulty in telling the truth related to his beautiful wife. Finally, they have Isaac. He's asked to sacrifice him. Abraham shows great faith and trust in God. The Lord provides. He buries his wife. He purchases land for a burial place, not only for her, but for their family, and really settles in the land. He owns land there now. And Isaac gets a bride. Abraham dies. Isaac does the same thing his dad did in lying about his beautiful wife. Learns to trust God. Jacob and Esau are born. Jacob has to leave the land to save his life. He eventually comes back, and he has a heart and interest to serve God. And now go to Genesis 34, because there's a passage there that we want to see that is a horrible passage that you should be asking yourself when you read through that, why is this here? Why do I have to read about this? Genesis 34. If you have a study Bible or a Bible with any kind of notes, probably at the top of that chapter it says something like Dinah defiled. Mine says the Dinah incident. Well, that's pretty vague, isn't it? And it's nowhere near an accurate description. And because of our audience, we can be pretty straightforward. Dinah is abducted and raped. And you read through this, and then you read the rest of the chapter, what Judah and Simeon and Levi do. They trick the men and this group of people. They lie to them, and they convince them to be circumcised in order to begin to have relationships, marriages, and partners in trade, and get along with them. And 3 days after, all of the men are circumcised when they're in such a delicate position, they can't physically do much. They walk in and they slaughter them. They kill all the men. And are you not asking the question, why is this in the Bible? Why is this here? And the answer to that question is in the text there as well, that the men of that village, when they raped Dinah, they are showing us what they're like. And in fact, there's a very interesting statement that's easy to forget. A little bit later in that chapter, when it talks about the man who did that, you know what it says about him? He was the most noble guy of all the men in that village. Now, if you only read that verse, the temptation is saying, oh, he's a pretty good guy. No, that's not what the Bible's saying. The best it gets is that guy. And they want to compromise. They want Israel to get along with them. Come on, let's be friends. You give us stuff, we'll give you stuff, we'll get along, and we can share this. We can get along. Can't we all just get along? And I think you're wise enough already to see where this is going. That, oh, wait, whoa. We can't do that. We can't do that in our present society, in our culture. We can't do that with so many different portions of wickedness that are invading our society. And Israel couldn't do that either. Why? Remember why? Because God promised that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through them. And Satan is saying, oh, man, I got to stop that. And one way he could do it is if he could just get them to become like everyone else and not be a people for God, and God pour his blessing out on them. And we'll move along because the cursed clock has moved. In the very next chapter, if you're there, chapter 35, isn't it interesting what God says in verse 1? God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother. And Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves and change your garments. Why did he need to do that? Oh, it wasn't a problem. He just made it up. No, already they have been influenced by the people in the land. And Jacob has to say, we need revival. You've got to get rid of this stuff. Put away the foreign gods, purify yourself, and change. And Jacob leads them in that change. And remember, they're still a small group of people. Now, after that, let's see. Brings us to chapter 36 about Esau. Again, you should be asking, why is all that information there? Esau leaves, goes to Edom, but they will be a plague to Israel. Then we have, beginning in chapter 37 through the end, you have Joseph. And what a great story that is. But Joseph shows us how God brought the children of Israel out of the land into Egypt. And we want to say at the end of Genesis, oh man, they lost the land. But know that that was always the plan. That if we were to go back to Genesis chapter 15, when God reiterated the promise, verse 13 through 16, God says, oh, Abraham, by the way, down the road, there's going to be a time when your descendants are going to suffer. And they're going to be taken out of the land. And he says they're going to go to Egypt and they're going to become slaves. And after about 400 years, I'm going to put them back in the land. And then he gives a reason. He says the time of the Amorites is not fulfilled. What's going on? You know, God is organizing redemption for mankind, and at the same time, He is trying to get the people of that day in that land to turn in repentance to Him. And so He gives the Amorites in the land 400 years to change their mind. Is God patient? Is He very gracious? You see, when we only pick up a chapter like chapter 34, where men are slaughtered, we only come to Judges and we read about villages being slaughtered and being commanded to destroy everybody. When we only see that, we've missed out on the rest of who God is. That God will take centuries in giving people an opportunity to turn to Him. And in fact, since the first men were created, God has been illustrating that man must have a redeemer, but God will be patient and will continue to give opportunity for men to have a redeemer. And so now, since the beginning of time, He's been doing that. Well, we're totally out of time. We didn't even get back to Judges. At some point, we'll come back to this. I might finish this tonight. Because I really want to get back to some real specific reasons answering the questions about the command to kill everybody. So I don't, yeah, I don't know if we can do that tonight or not. Yeah, there is a generation of leaders after Joshua. They're not generally named, though. We're going to see them again in just a few minutes, because what we find is Joshua did a good job, that generation did a good job, and then it does it. Well, what happened? And we're going to see that in the text this morning. I hate ending like this. So you got to come back for the second part of it. So let's pray. Father, I pray that you would give us help and wisdom, and help us to recognize your grace through times of great difficulty. And historically, you've always shown mercy. And so we thank you for that. And thank you for having fulfilled your promise to bless us through the coming of Christ and providing redemption for us. And thank you that we have certainty of salvation through Him. And we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.